The year was 1866. The American Civil War had officially ended, but its shadows stretched long across the landscape of Missouri. If you were wandering the rolling plains and forests, you might have heard whispers about men who moved like shadows, men who took advantage of the chaos left in the war's wake. Among them was Jesse James, a name that would later become synonymous with outlaw legend. But before the stories of dramatic robberies and violent shootouts, there was a quieter, perhaps even more insidious kind of story. The day-to-day existence of a man caught between war, lawlessness, and survival. You see, Missouri had been a border state, torn apart, not just by the national conflict, but by a local one, neighbors fighting neighbors, in what historians later called guerrilla skirmishes. Jesse James was born in 1,847 inches, Clay County, Missouri, and by the time he was a teenager, he had witnessed unimaginable violence. It was not abstract, it was intimate, personal. Men he knew, friends of his father, were shot in the fields or dragged from their homes. He watched as families fled from one town to another, seeking safety from guerrillas who might emerge from the trees at any moment. In such a world, survival demanded cunning and ruthlessness. The James family itself was well acquainted with tragedy. Jesse's father, Robert James, had been a respected farmer, and his mother, Zerelda, a determined woman who held the household together. But Missouri was not kind to those who sought peace. The James family endured raids, theft, and threats from both Union and Confederate sympathizers. For a young Jesse, the line between legal authority and banditry was blurred. The same men who claimed to enforce the law might kill indiscriminately, and those who sought vengeance might take it themselves. It was a landscape where the law was sometimes absent, sometimes corrupt, and sometimes lethally partial. In such an environment, a boy learned quickly that violence could protect life as much as it could destroy it. By his mid-teens, Jesse James had joined Confederate guerrilla units, known for their brutality and tactical cunning. These were not conventional soldiers. They were irregular fighters, often called bushwhackers. They specialized in ambushes, raids, and a form of psychological warfare designed to terrify the local population. Jesse's involvement was not glamorous. There were long waits in the forests, freezing winters, scarce food, and constant danger. Survival meant foraging, scouting, and learning the land as a form of armor. He learned to move silently, observe the patterns of patrols, and strike swiftly. These skills, acquired in adolescence, would later translate seamlessly into the life of an outlaw. The James Younger Gang, which would form after the war, was built on this foundation. Along with associates like the Younger Brothers, became part of a network of men who knew the land, the law, and the people. The gang's first robberies were careful, calculated affairs, small scale, designed to minimize risk. They robbed stores, stagecoaches, and trains, often in towns that had only recently been destabilized by the war. But behind the thrill of the heist was a deep understanding of human behavior. Jesse knew that fear could be as valuable as bullets. A merchant might cooperate if he believed resistance was futile. Townsfolk might stay silent if they understood that interference could bring lethal consequences. The gang's early successes were as much psychological as they were criminal. Daily life for Jesse James was deceptively mundane, even when his reputation began to spread. He had routines, scouting locations, checking weapons, and maintaining horses. Horses were vital. A slow horse could mean death or capture. Guns needed constant care, and ammunition had to be preserved. Even during the height of his outlaw activity, he attended to these tasks meticulously. The romance of the Wild West shootouts at high noon, daring escapes, obscured the grind. Hours of waiting, observation, and careful preparation preceded any action. It was a life built on anticipation, patience, and meticulous attention to detail. The danger was ever present, but so too was the need for quiet, almost boring discipline. Interestingly, Jesse also maintained connections with the local community, despite his criminal activities. In towns where the James family had long-standing relationships, He was not universally feared. Some merchants provided shelter or information, recognizing that Jesse's actions were sometimes more about survival than cruelty. This duality, terrorist and local figure, lawbreaker and neighbor, added layers to his daily existence. It was not a life of pure adrenaline. It was interwoven with subtle negotiations, tacit alliances, and constant risk assessment. Jesse's understanding of human psychology, combined with his tactical skills, allowed him to navigate this complex social terrain with surprising dexterity. By 1867, Jesse James had already participated in several armed robberies. His targets were usually banks or trains, institutions perceived as impersonal and wealthy, less likely to provoke sympathy. Each robbery required meticulous planning. Maps were drawn, escape routes memorized, horses positioned strategically. The gang calculated the timing down to minutes, noting when guards would be shifted, when townspeople were occupied, and even when the weather could aid or hinder their plans. Jesse's ability to anticipate these variables was honed in his guerrilla days. The skill set developed in war translated almost seamlessly to crime. Knowledge of terrain, understanding of timing, and insight into human behavior. One early train robbery in Adair, Missouri, illustrates this perfectly. Jesse and his gang did not simply ride in guns blazing. They studied schedules, observed the station for weeks, and chose a moment when minimal passengers were aboard. Their approach was methodical. The train would be stopped, the engineer and conductor restrained, valuables taken with efficiency, and the crew allowed to escape unharmed, leaving behind fear and uncertainty rather than bodies. The operation was clean, almost clinical, yet the townspeople were left unsettled, knowing that ordinary routines could be disrupted at any moment. For Jesse James, this was the essence of power, the capacity to control fear, manipulate circumstances, and remain a step ahead of the law. Despite these calculated actions, Jesse's life was far from glamorous. Horses needed feed, weapons wore out, and wounds sometimes festered. Injuries were treated in makeshift conditions, often with primitive remedies. Supplies were scarce, and safe havens were few. The gang had to remain mobile, avoiding towns with significant law enforcement, while maintaining a network of allies who could provide temporary shelter or intelligence. The narrative of the lone gunman is misleading. In reality, Jesse's survival depended on meticulous planning, cooperation, and endurance. Life as an outlaw was a continuous negotiation with risk, comfort, and necessity. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Jesse James' early career is how ordinary much of it was. People tend to focus on dramatic shootouts or daring escapes. Yet these events were only the visible peaks of a landscape dominated by long periods of waiting, observation, and preparation. Jesse James's brilliance and his eventual legend was rooted in his ability to endure these mundane demands without losing focus. In a world of uncertainty and danger, persistence, patience, and discipline became as crucial as courage or marksmanship. This was a life of quiet calculation, disguised by the occasional flourish of violence. But what drove Jesse James beyond survival and tactical skill? Was it loyalty to his comrades, a thirst for wealth, or something deeper, a response to the brutal world that had shaped his youth? Could a boy who witnessed neighbors killed, families displaced, and towns torn apart ever reconcile with ordinary society? Or was he destined to live on the edge, navigating a world where fear and cunning dictated every decision? The answers remained elusive, buried within the patterns of his actions and the silence of Missouri's forests. The story of Jesse James had only begun, and while his later years would be immortalized in folklore, the foundations of his life, the mundane, painstakingly careful decisions, the quiet endurance, and the constant presence of danger hinted at the complexity behind the legend. What came next for Jesse, and how did these early experiences shape the choices that would make him both infamous and enduringly fascinating, remained a question that Missouri's rolling plains seemed to whisper, waiting for those willing to listen closely. By the late 1860s, Jesse James had evolved from a boy shaped by war into a figure both feared and admired in Missouri. His reputation was no accident. It was the product of methodical actions, careful planning, and an understanding of the precarious balance between violence and public perception. While the general public imagined the Wild West as a place of constant gunfights and lawless chaos, the daily life of an outlaw like Jesse was far more structured and routine than legend often allows. There were calendars of opportunity, maps of terrain memorized, and a social network that needed to be constantly managed, whether through loyalty, fear, or mutual benefit. One of the essential elements of Jesse's survival was his relationship with the land itself. Missouri's landscape is a mixture of dense forests, rolling hills, and river valleys, all of which could be turned into a strategic advantage. Jesse and the James Younger gang understood these spaces intimately. They knew which ridges offered the best lookout, which river bends provided concealment, and which paths allowed for rapid escape if a pursuit turned dangerous. The land was not simply a backdrop. It was an active participant in their survival strategy. Unlike Hollywood portrayals of dramatic, open plains shootouts, most successful ambushes and robberies relied on camouflage, timing, and spatial awareness. Jesse's intimate knowledge of his environment allowed him to anticipate lawmen's movements and exploit even minor oversights. Alongside geography, logistics were a constant concern. Outlaws needed food, water, ammunition, and transportation, all of which required planning. Foraging or raiding could provide supplies, but both carried risks. Supplies had to be concealed and distributed in ways that minimized exposure. Horses, for example, could not be left in predictable locations for long. A captured or stolen horse was both a tool and a liability. Guns had to be cleaned and maintained, ammunition stored carefully to prevent damage, and clothing suitable for blending into the natural environment. This was not the glamorous life often portrayed in dime novels. It was a slow, meticulous effort to maintain readiness in a world where one lapse could be fatal. Yet, even with careful preparation, life as an outlaw was socially complex. Jesse James cultivated a network of allies and sympathizers, particularly among former Confederate supporters. Many Missourians saw him as more than a criminal. To them, he was a figure resisting Northern authority, avenging the devastation of war, and asserting a sense of local justice in a chaotic post-war society. These connections were delicate. Sympathy could turn into betrayal if Jesse misread the loyalties of his associates or townspeople. Letters, coded messages, and secret meetings became part of the routine. Outlaws operated not just with weapons, but with intelligence networks, surveillance, and psychological insight, understanding that relationships could be as critical to survival as firepower. One striking illustration of this occurred during the infamous robbery at Gallatin, Missouri. In 1869, Jesse James, along with a small group of men, targeted a local bank in a town where tensions from the Civil War still simmered. The robbery was not a sudden dash into town. It was the result of weeks of careful observation. Jesse noted the movements of the sheriff, the hours when townspeople were distracted by daily routines, and even the location of windows that provided both visibility and concealment. On the day of the robbery, the gang moved with precision, controlling the scene with minimal violence. They aimed not to create chaos for its own sake, but to extract money while limiting unnecessary exposure. The local citizens watched in a mix of awe and fear, unsure whether to intervene, comply, or flee. Behind these public acts, however, there was another layer to Jesse James's life, moments of quiet reflection, boredom, and routine. Many evenings were spent tending to horses, repairing weapons, and waiting out patrols or law enforcement searches. Bandits had to manage risk continuously, making countless minor decisions that cumulatively determined life or death. This slow rhythm planning, waiting, observing, was punctuated by moments of sudden, intense action, a rhythm that few outsiders truly understood. Jesse's ability to endure these long periods of apparent inactivity while maintaining readiness for sudden violence was a hallmark of his success. The psychological toll of such a life cannot be overstated. Jesse James lived in constant awareness of betrayal, ambush, and the consequences of misjudgment. Many members of the James Younger gang were eventually killed or imprisoned, often due to minor mistakes, miscommunication, or sheer misfortune. Fear was a constant companion, but it was managed, controlled, and, in some ways, used as a tool. Jesse's understanding of human behavior extended beyond his victims. It included his own men, the townspeople, and even law enforcement. He recognized that morale, perception, and loyalty were as influential as gunpowder in shaping outcomes. Survival demanded not just physical skill, but acute emotional and social intelligence. The public image of Jesse James, which grew rapidly through newspapers and word of mouth, was also carefully managed, intentionally or not. Stories of daring robberies, narrow escapes, and unyielding courage spread, painting him as both heroic and terrifying. Yet these stories often omitted the long periods of monotony, the careful planning, and the mundane survival strategies that underpinned his actions. Jesse's life demonstrates how history often remembers only the moments of drama, while forgetting the silent, laborious work that made those moments possible. His legend was built on the intersection of myth and meticulous practice, an interplay that blurred the line between reality and folklore. By 1870, the James Younger gang had escalated their activities, targeting larger institutions, including trains and banks with significant cash reserves. Each new venture carried increased risk. Law enforcement agencies were improving their techniques. Coordination among towns and counties was increasing, and the Pinkerton Detective Agency had begun to actively pursue the gang. Jesse understood that adaptation was crucial. He studied the approaches of detectives, noted patterns in patrols, and adjusted tactics accordingly. The life of an outlaw was not static. It required constant learning and reassessment, with a keen awareness that the next mistake could be fatal. Despite the escalation in their criminal activities, Jesse and his associates maintained routines that reflected the broader patterns of daily life. They needed rest, food, and shelter, and they engaged in social interactions with family and allies whenever possible. These moments of ordinary life were juxtaposed against periods of extreme danger, creating a rhythm of existence that was both exhausting and psychologically taxing. Jesse James's ability to navigate these extremes, maintaining calm during planning and composure during chaos, was key to his survival. It also laid the groundwork for his eventual mythologization, a man who could seamlessly move between the mundane and the extraordinary, between routine life and violent legend. Yet, for all the skill and planning, the life of Jesse James was inherently unstable. Each robbery, each ambush, each calculated risk could tip toward disaster. Allies could betray him, horses could falter, or the weather could turn against him. Small miscalculations could lead to deadly encounters with lawmen or rival factions. The very skills that allowed him to survive discipline, observation, and patience were constantly tested against the unpredictability of human behavior and natural forces. It was a precarious equilibrium, one that demanded both cunning and endurance. As the 1,870 seconds approached, Jesse James faced a crucial question. Could he continue navigating this treacherous life indefinitely, or would the inevitable consequence of cumulative risk finally catch up with him? The foundations of his legend, his intelligence, skill, and careful management of fear were formidable. Yet the law was persistent, and luck could only carry a man so far. In a world where both the mundane and the dramatic shaped outcomes, Jesse James' next moves would determine whether he remained a survivor, a fugitive, or a historical footnote. And so, as Missouri's forests whispered with the wind and the quiet of small towns seemed fragile under the weight of post-war instability, one could only wonder, how long could a man like Jesse James continue walking the razor's edge between infamy and survival? The answer would not be found in the legends, but in the next series of careful, calculated choices that would define his life and the lives of those around him. By the early 1,870 seconds, Jesse James had fully transitioned from a teenage guerrilla into one of the most notorious outlaws of post-war Missouri. His life had become a continuous cycle of planning, movement, and careful calculation. punctuated by the occasional dramatic robbery. Yet, beneath the layers of myth and legend, Jesse's story was fundamentally shaped by ordinary survival strategies, disciplined routines, and an acute understanding of human psychology. Every decision he made, from choosing a safe house to coordinating an ambush, was guided by a relentless desire to remain one step ahead of the law and one step ahead of death. The notoriety of the James Younger gang reached its peak during a series of train robberies in the mid-1870s. These robberies were meticulously orchestrated affairs, unlike the haphazard depictions often found in popular culture. Horses were positioned in advance for rapid escape. Gang members communicated using subtle signals and pre-arranged codes. Even the weather and time of day were considered in planning. Jesse, who understood the psychological dimension of crime, sought to instill fear and awe in equal measure. He often allowed witnesses to see the gang in action, but limited violence to avoid turning public sentiment entirely against them. Each robbery was both a financial operation and a performance, a calculated demonstration of control over space, time, and perception. Despite their success, these criminal ventures were increasingly precarious. Law enforcement in Missouri had become more organized. Local sheriffs, aided by Pinkerton detectives and federal marshals, were constantly monitoring roads, towns, and likely hideouts. Jesse knew that the slightest mistake, a miscalculation in timing, an unfamiliar patrol, or an untrustworthy accomplice, could result in capture or death. This awareness heightened his sense of vigilance and forced him to maintain a lifestyle of constant alertness. Outlaw life, far from being romantic, was psychologically exhausting. Every day involved navigating a web of potential threats, evaluating the loyalties of friends, and predicting the moves of enemies. One of the most infamous turning points in Jesse's career was the ill-fated Northfield, Minnesota raid of 1876. Unlike prior operations in Missouri, this attempt involved unfamiliar terrain, increased resistance, and logistical challenges that the gang had underestimated. The plan required precise coordination. They would rob the First National Bank, restrain the townspeople, and escape via a planned route. Yet, despite meticulous preparation, the town's citizens reacted with unexpected resilience. People fought back, summoned reinforcements, and turned ordinary objects into defensive tools. The ambush quickly turned into a chaotic gunfight. Horses bolted, some gang members were shot, and the operation collapsed in disarray. Jesse and Frank James survived, but the younger brothers were captured or killed. This disaster illustrates a central truth of Jesse's life. No matter how disciplined, skilled, or prepared he was, chance, human unpredictability, and environmental factors could always disrupt even the most careful plans. It also underscored the limits of fear and intimidation. While terror could control many towns, it could not override the determination of communities that refused to submit. Jesse's survival depended not only on physical skill, but on the flexibility to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances, a skill he had honed since his youth in Missouri's war-torn landscapes. Following Northfield, Jesse retreated to more familiar territory in Missouri. He rebuilt his network, reassessed his operations, and continued to exploit his knowledge of terrain and local loyalties. For a while, this approach proved effective. The gang resumed smaller-scale robberies, carefully chosen for minimal risk and maximal gain. Jesse's understanding of human behavior allowed him to navigate communities with subtlety. He could identify those likely to assist him, those to avoid, and those whose fears could be leveraged to his advantage. In essence, survival was not simply about firepower, it was about perception, trust, and control over the environment. The public perception of Jesse James during these years oscillated between admiration and fear. Newspapers often sensationalized his exploits, portraying him as a Robin Hood figure resisting authority, though in reality, the reality was far less romantic. Jesse's criminal activities were motivated by a combination of personal survival, loyalty to his gang, and perhaps lingering resentment from the Civil War's destruction of his community. Yet, the myth-making surrounding him, bolstered by dime novels and word of mouth, created a legend that would outlast his life. People were fascinated by the contrast between his calm, methodical preparation and the sudden bursts of violence that punctuated his actions. Even as he became a symbol of the outlaw era, Jesse's life remained governed by mundane necessities. Horses had to be fed, guns cleaned, and safe houses maintained. Letters needed to be written discreetly, supplies procured, and lookout positions rotated. Relationships with allies had to be carefully managed. In short, the dramatic robberies and shootouts were only the visible peaks of an iceberg built on the slow, methodical work of survival. Jesse James's genius and his legend lay not in reckless bravado, but in his ability to navigate this tension between danger and preparation. Jesse's life, however, was inevitably finite. By the late 1870 seconds and early 1880 seconds, law enforcement pressure intensified, and the web of potential betrayals widened. The very strategies that had kept him alive for over a decade could no longer guarantee safety. On the 3rd of April 1882, in a modest house in St. Joseph, Missouri, Jesse James was killed by Robert Ford, a former gang member seeking reward and recognition. Ford's act was not the result of a dramatic showdown in a canyon or a high noon duel. It was a carefully planned, intimate act that ended the life of one of America's most famous outlaws. In death, as in life, Jesse James's story was governed by the intersection of human psychology, loyalty, and careful calculation. The quiet, often overlooked elements that shaped his legend as much as any dramatic robbery. Reflecting on Jesse James's life, one sees the complexity beneath the surface of legend. He was a man shaped by war, geography, and social instability. A man whose survival depended on patience, discipline, and acute awareness of human behavior. The stories of daring shootouts and robberies often overshadow the far more mundane and exhausting realities of outlaw life. Waiting for weeks in the woods, maintaining weapons, coordinating with allies, and continuously navigating risk. In the end, it was these quiet strategies, these ordinary acts of preparation and vigilance, that defined his life and legacy more than any single dramatic event. Jesse James reminds us that history is not solely written by extraordinary moments of heroism or violence, but by the accumulation of ordinary, painstaking decisions that shape survival and influence outcomes. His story is a window into the harsh, often boring realities of life in post-war Missouri, where the line between legality and criminality was blurred, and where survival required both cunning and endurance. The legend, for all its romance and drama, rests on the meticulous, often invisible work of living in a dangerous world. And yet, one cannot help but wonder, had Jesse James been born a decade later, in a more stable time, would he have become an outlaw at all? Or was the violent, chaotic world of post-Civil War Missouri a crucible that forged him into the figure history remembers? The question lingers, a quiet echo of the forests, rivers, and towns that shaped both the man and the myth. William H. Bonney, better known as Billy the Kid, was born in 1859 inches, the small town of New York City, though his story would unfold thousands of miles away in the rugged, lawless territories of the American Southwest. Unlike Jesse James, whose early years were shaped by the chaotic violence of the Civil War, Billy the Kid came of age in a region defined by economic instability, territorial disputes, and the constant tension between settlers, ranchers, and Native American communities. By the time he reached adolescence, he was living in the New Mexico Territory, an environment that would cultivate both his survival instincts and his reputation as a young outlaw. Billy's early life was marked by transience and instability. His father, Henry McCarty, died when Billy was a child, leaving his mother, Catherine, to care for the family under harsh circumstances. Poverty was a constant companion, and the family moved frequently between towns and settlements in search of work and shelter. These frequent relocations introduced young Billy to the patterns of survival in frontier life. He quickly learned to read the landscape not just physically, but socially. He observed who wielded power, who could be trusted, and where danger might emerge unexpectedly. These observations would later inform his interactions with both allies and enemies, giving him a tactical edge in a world where trust was rare and violence often sudden. By the mid-1870s, Billy had begun to engage in petty theft and minor criminal activity. These early infractions were not motivated by some innate desire for infamy. They were pragmatic, sometimes impulsive, and almost always tied to survival. Stealing food, small livestock, or tools was a practical necessity for a boy living in constant economic precarity. Yet, these minor crimes had consequences. Local authorities, limited as they were in the sparsely populated territory, sometimes pursued him, while other times they relied on community pressure and informal social regulation to maintain order. Billy quickly learned that speed, cunning, and the ability to vanish were as important as any physical skill. Each escape or close encounter reinforced his understanding of risk management and the importance of preparation. Billy's adolescence coincided with a period known as the Lincoln County War, a conflict that erupted in 1878 between rival factions of ranchers, merchants, and political interests in southeastern New Mexico. The war created an environment in which violence became a tool for settling disputes and asserting dominance. Billy, by then, in his late teens, became involved with the Regulators, a group aligned with one faction, seeking revenge for the murder of a local merchant. His involvement was pragmatic. The conflict offered both opportunity and protection. Within this faction, Billy honed skills he had begun developing in petty crime, marksmanship, stealth, and the ability to anticipate the movements of opponents. He also gained exposure to more organized forms of armed confrontation, learning that survival in a conflict required discipline, patience, and a keen understanding of human behavior. The daily life of Billy the Kid during this period was far from the romanticized depictions of gunfights and narrow escapes that would later dominate stories about him. Much of his existence involved routine surveillance, guarding positions, scouting movements of rival factions, and maintaining equipment. Horses required feeding and grooming, firearms demanded careful cleaning, and ammunition had to be preserved under harsh environmental conditions. In the dry, unpredictable climate of New Mexico, even minor oversights like leaving a gun exposed to sand and heat could result in catastrophic failure during a confrontation. These mundane tasks, often overlooked in popular narratives, were critical to the effectiveness of Billy and his associates. Despite the constant danger, Billy also demonstrated an early understanding of social strategy. He built alliances, identified who could be trusted, and learned to navigate the shifting loyalties of a conflict-ridden territory. The Lincoln County War was not simply a series of random skirmishes. It was a tightly knit network of vendettas, debts, and political maneuvering. Misjudging an ally's loyalty or underestimating an opponent could have immediate, fatal consequences. Billy's ability to read social dynamics, combined with his physical skills, gave him a rare advantage for someone so young. It was this combination that would eventually elevate him from a local troublemaker to a figure of legend in the West. One early episode that illustrates both his cunning and the precarious nature of his environment occurred during a small-scale raid on a rival ranch. Billy, alongside a few companions, approached the property under the cover of darkness. The plan was simple: retrieve livestock or supplies while avoiding confrontation with the armed ranch hands. Yet, the operation required meticulous observation. Billy had to determine guard routines, identify potential escape routes, and calculate timing down to the minute. The raid itself was brief and quiet, but it highlighted the elements that defined his survival: intelligence gathering, quick decision-making, and the ability to exploit the environment. The small successes built both confidence and reputation, signaling to allies and adversaries alike that Billy the Kid was a capable and unpredictable young man. The combination of youth, audacity, and strategic thinking quickly set him apart. People in the region took notice, and whispers of the Kid spread through towns and settlements. Yet fame was not without risk. Each act of defiance drew the attention of law enforcement and rival factions. Every success increased the stakes, and each close call underscored the fragility of survival in a volatile environment. Billy's choices were constrained not only by the immediate demands of his circumstances, but also by the reputation he was cultivating, whether intentionally or as a byproduct of necessity. The line between legend and survival strategy blurred as he navigated the dangerous social and physical landscape of New Mexico. Interestingly, Billy the Kid's story also underscores the monotony that underlies much of outlaw life. Between the dramatic moments of raids or gunfights were long stretches of preparation, waiting, and observation. Horses had to be tended, equipment repaired, and terrain scouted. Supplies had to be sourced, often through negotiation or minor theft. Social connections had to be nurtured carefully. In other words, the life of a teenage outlaw was dominated less by the cinematic drama of gunfights and more by mundane, often tedious work that ensured survival. The reality of his existence was as much about patience, persistence, and logistical management as it was about daring exploits. By the end of 1878, Billy's early career had already established him as a figure of significance in the region. His actions, though minor in the scope of history, reflected a larger pattern of frontier life. Young men navigating extreme social and environmental instability, relying on a combination of skill, cunning, and endurance to survive. His legend, like that of Jesse James, would later amplify and romanticize these formative years, focusing on audacity and violence, while leaving the slow, careful work of survival largely invisible. Yet it was precisely this careful attention to detail, combined with a willingness to exploit opportunity, that ensured he would remain a central figure in the story of the American West. And so, as Billy the Kid moved through the dusty streets and rugged hills of New Mexico, one cannot help but wonder how much of his future legend was predetermined by circumstance and how much was a product of his own calculated choices. Could a boy shaped by poverty, instability, and constant danger avoid becoming an outlaw? Or was the chaotic environment of the Southwest simply too compelling, too harsh, and too unyielding to resist? These questions linger, quietly, as the story of his early crimes begins to unfold. Following his early forays into petty theft and minor confrontations, Billy the Kid's life quickly became entwined with the larger, more violent conflicts that defined New Mexico territory in the late 1872s. By 1878, the Lincoln County War had fully erupted, leaving towns, ranches, and merchants caught in a swirl of political intrigue, economic rivalry, and revenge killings. For Billy, this conflict offered both opportunity and danger in equal measure. Unlike a simple life of crime, the war required strategic thinking, careful alliances, and the capacity to navigate rapid, unpredictable shifts in power. It was a crucible that would test every skill he had acquired in his youth. And it was in this environment that the contours of his enduring legend began to take shape. Billy was aligned with the Regulators, a faction that sought justice or vengeance against the powerful Murphy-Dolan faction responsible for the murder of local merchant John Tunstall. Tunstall had been an ally, a figure who offered employment and protection to young men like Billy, and his murder ignited a chain of retaliatory violence. For Billy and others in the Regulators, the war was not an abstract struggle for power. It was deeply personal. Loyalty, honor, and a sense of moral obligation shaped every decision. Yet, these ideals were constantly tested against the practicalities of survival in a region where violence was often spontaneous and law enforcement was limited, underfunded, or openly partisan. The daily life of Billy during this period was dominated by reconnaissance, travel, and intermittent skirmishes. He spent long hours on horseback, moving through rugged terrain to monitor the movements of rival factions, observe patrols, and identify potential ambush sites. Knowledge of the land was critical. Hills, valleys, and river crossings provided both cover and strategic advantage. In many ways, the geography of New Mexico acted as both a shield and a weapon. A small, well-positioned group could hold a defensible position against larger forces, exploiting natural features to compensate for numerical inferiority. Billy, with his growing experience, became adept at reading the landscape, predicting the actions of opponents, and exploiting opportunities that others overlooked. One particularly illustrative incident occurred in late 1878, when the regulators were tracking members of the Murphy-Dolan faction, who had fled to a remote ranch. Billy, along with several associates, carefully observed the property from hidden vantage points over several days. They noted guard rotations, routines, and vulnerabilities. When they finally approached, they executed a measured raid that avoided unnecessary confrontation, achieving their objective with minimal exposure. This episode highlights a recurring pattern in Billy's behavior. Even amidst conflict, he emphasized calculated action, careful observation, and risk management. Violence was not indiscriminate. It was a tool applied with deliberation. Yet, the Lincoln County War was far from orderly. Skirmishes were sudden, information unreliable, and loyalties often fluid. Allies could become adversaries, and neutral parties could unexpectedly intervene. In this environment, Billy's ability to adapt quickly became essential. He learned to make decisions in the midst of chaos, to interpret incomplete information, and to anticipate the responses of both allies and enemies. These skills, honed in a teenage life already steeped in survival challenges, allowed him to navigate a landscape where misjudgment could result in instant death. His reputation for daring, while partially earned in dramatic confrontations, was also grounded in this consistent, disciplined application of skill under pressure. Despite the intensity of these engagements, much of Billy's time was spent in waiting, planning, and preparing. Horses had to be fed and rested, weapons cleaned, ammunition preserved, and supplies for prolonged excursions secured. Campsites needed to be concealed, and social networks maintained through discreet communication. These mundane tasks, repeated daily, formed the backbone of his effectiveness. The dramatic gunfights, which later became central to his legend, were only brief spikes in a much longer continuum of meticulous preparation and cautious maneuvering. Without this underlying structure, no daring act of violence could be sustained. Billy's personal relationships also played a critical role in shaping his life during this period. He was close to other young men in the regulators, relying on trust and cooperation to survive in dangerous circumstances. He was also connected to families and local residents who provided information, shelter, or logistical support. These relationships were fragile and constantly tested by fear, ambition, and shifting alliances. Billy's capacity to read human behavior, cultivate loyalty, and exploit fear became as important as his skill with a gun. In many ways, the social landscape of the Southwest mirrored the physical one. Survival required careful negotiation, observation, and strategic action. The psychological dimension of Billy the Kid's life during the Lincoln County War is equally striking. He was a teenager thrust into a violent, unstable environment, forced to make decisions with potentially fatal consequences daily. The stress, fear, and exhaustion inherent in this life demanded extraordinary mental resilience. Billy displayed an unusual combination of audacity and caution. While he took risks, they were often calculated, informed by careful observation and a deep understanding of human behavior. This balance between boldness and prudence allowed him to survive where others did not. By the end of 1878, Billy's reputation had spread far beyond the immediate confines of Lincoln County. Stories of his exploits, shootouts, raids, and escapes circulated widely, often exaggerated, creating a narrative that amplified his notoriety. Yet behind the legend were the unglamorous realities of survival: long hours of observation, repetitive maintenance of equipment, careful monitoring of allies and enemies, and the constant calculation of risk. These elements, while less exciting than tales of dramatic heroism or violence, were fundamental to his success and longevity as an outlaw. The Lincoln County War eventually drew the attention of more organized law enforcement and federal authorities, intensifying the dangers Billy faced. Each engagement now carried greater risk, and the possibility of betrayal or capture increased. Despite his skill, the environment was unforgiving. The war underscored a critical aspect of his life, that survival depended on continuous adaptation, awareness, and meticulous planning. The young outlaw who had once survived petty theft and minor skirmishes now faced a landscape dominated by deadly conflict, political complexity, and increasing public attention. And yet, even in the midst of escalating violence and danger, one must pause to consider the mundane, often invisible aspects of Billy the Kid's life. Every successful raid or confrontation relied on hours of preparation, careful observation, and disciplined execution. Every narrow escape was built on prior experience, intelligence gathering, and logistical foresight. The excitement that later defined his legend was underpinned by a slow, relentless rhythm of ordinary survival strategies. The life of a young outlaw was as much about patience, endurance, and strategic thinking as it was about courage or recklessness. As the Lincoln County War moved into its final phases, the trajectory of Billy the Kid's life remained uncertain. Could he continue navigating this violent, unpredictable world, or would the cumulative pressures of conflict, law enforcement, and chance eventually overtake him? The young man who had survived thefts, skirmishes, and ambushes now faced an increasingly organized and determined opposition. How he would respond, and whether he could reconcile survival with the growing demands of reputation and legend, remained an open question, lingering in the dusty streets and rugged hills of the Southwest, waiting to be answered in the next chapter of his life. By the end of 1878, the Lincoln County War had left southeastern New Mexico scarred with violence, fear, and instability. Billy the Kid, still barely 20 years old, had emerged as one of the central figures in this conflict. His life was a constant oscillation between moments of explosive violence and stretches of careful, methodical survival. The legend of Billy the Kid, romanticized in dime novels, newspapers, and oral histories, tended to focus on dramatic shootouts, daring escapes, and the seeming recklessness of a teenage outlaw. Yet beneath these moments of notoriety lay a life dominated by mundane survival strategies, careful observation, and relentless risk assessment. After the hostilities of the Lincoln County War subsided, Billy found himself increasingly hunted. Law enforcement, now more organized and determined, began closing in. The New Mexico authorities, aided in some cases by federal marshals, sought to end the reign of the regulators and bring an end to frontier violence. For Billy, this meant constant movement, hiding, and strategic planning. Every journey through the rugged terrain of New Mexico demanded consideration of patrol routes, loyal allies, and safe refuges. The life of an outlaw was as much about geography and logistics as it was about courage or firepower. Knowledge of terrain, escape routes, and human behavior became essential tools in navigating a world where a single misstep could be fatal. One of the most well-known episodes of this period was the famous escape from the Lincoln County Jail in 1881. Billy had been arrested after a series of escalating incidents, including killings associated with feuds and retaliation for previous attacks. The jail itself was not a fortress. It was a small, makeshift structure with few resources. Yet, the escape was not a spontaneous act of daring. It was the result of careful observation, patience, and the exploitation of predictable routines. Billy noted guard movements, weaknesses in physical barriers, and the timing of nearby residents' routines. Using these insights, he was able to overpower his captors and escape a feat that cemented his reputation for cunning and audacity. But even this dramatic event highlights an often overlooked truth about Billy's life. The hours, days, and even weeks of preparation preceding the escape were far more important than the few minutes of action that captured public attention. Horses needed to be readied, weapons maintained, and the surrounding area scouted. The escape was as much about logistics, discipline, and patience as it was about bravery. In this sense, the legend of the kid's audacity masks the reality of meticulous planning and the slow, deliberate work of survival. Without these preparations, the escape and his continued survival would have been impossible. The latter years of Billy's life were defined by a relentless cycle of pursuit and evasion. Small skirmishes, minor robberies, and interactions with allies punctuated long periods of hiding and travel. He relied heavily on loyal supporters in local communities who provided shelter, information, and assistance, often at great personal risk. The support networks were fragile, requiring constant attention, negotiation, and sometimes intimidation. Every move demanded careful consideration. A single misstep in trusting the wrong person could result in betrayal, capture, or death. The life of Billy the Kid illustrates how survival in a lawless frontier depended as much on managing relationships and logistics as on marksmanship or bravery. Billy's reputation, while growing, became a double-edged sword. Each story of daring exploits and narrow escapes enhanced his notoriety, but simultaneously made him a higher-profile target. Law enforcement, increasingly determined to bring him to justice, coordinated strategies that tested his adaptability. He faced more organized opposition, patrols, and surveillance. Each encounter required precise calculation, rapid decision-making, and, at times, sheer luck. The young outlaw's ability to navigate these pressures was extraordinary, and it relied on the skills he had developed throughout his adolescent years: observation, improvisation, endurance, and a profound understanding of human behavior. Yet, for all his cunning and skill, the environment Billy navigated was unforgiving. Violence, poverty, and political instability had shaped him, but they also imposed limits. Each act of defiance, each escape, and each robbery carried inherent risk. The constant stress of evasion and survival weighed heavily, demanding both physical stamina and psychological resilience. The life of an outlaw was not continuous excitement. It was punctuated by monotony, vigilance, and the relentless calculation of risk versus reward. Every day involved small, unglamorous decisions that cumulatively determined life or death. The end of Billy the Kid's life came in 1881, at the age of 21. Sheriff Pat Garrett, after months of pursuit and careful planning, tracked him to Fort Sumner, New Mexico. The confrontation was quiet, intimate, and devoid of dramatic showdowns in wide open spaces. Garrett shot Billy in a room while he was unarmed, a reminder that, in the end, survival in such a dangerous world often depended on luck, timing, and circumstances beyond skill or planning. The famed outlaw was dead, but the life he had led, the combination of daring, patience, observation, and calculated risk, left an indelible mark on the history of the American West. Reflecting on Billy the Kid's early crimes and eventual demise, several patterns emerge that reveal the nature of outlaw life. First, survival depended on meticulous preparation, careful observation, and adaptability. Second, social networks, loyalty, and human psychology were as critical as physical skill or courage. Third, the legend of audacity, while compelling, often obscures the underlying mundane and methodical processes that allowed these figures to operate effectively. The quiet, invisible labor of survival, patrolling, scouting, preparing, and negotiating was as significant as the dramatic acts that captured public imagination. Billy the Kid's story reminds us that the line between myth and reality in history is often drawn by selective memory and sensationalized narratives. While popular culture emphasizes gunfights and bold escapes, the actual life of a young outlaw was dominated by careful strategy, persistence, and an intimate understanding of both the land and human behavior. His trajectory from a poverty-stricken youth to one of the most infamous figures of the Wild West reflects not only personal skill, but the shaping power of environment, circumstance, and relentless necessity. And yet, one must wonder, had Billy been born in a more stable, predictable world, would he have become an outlaw at all? Was his fate sealed by the violent, unstable environment of the New Mexico territory? Or did his particular combination of skill, audacity, and adaptability make him uniquely suited to this life? The answer remains elusive, leaving the dusty trails, abandoned homesteads, and rugged hills of the Southwest to silently testify to a young man whose life and legend were inseparably intertwined. The American West of the late 19th century was a vast, unpredictable landscape, dotted with small towns, sprawling ranches, and the ever-present arteries of commerce, the railroads. Trains carried wealth, goods, and letters across hundreds of miles, and for ambitious outlaws, they represented both opportunity and peril. Among those who saw trains as the ultimate prize was the Dalton Gang, a group of men whose ambition often exceeded their caution. Unlike Jesse James, who had honed patience and careful planning over years, the Daltons were audacious to a fault, their stories defined as much by failure as by daring. Their missteps, particularly in train robberies, reveal a fascinating, often overlooked side of outlaw life. The meticulous preparation required, the human errors that could ruin even the best-laid plans, and the mundane challenges that underpinned every attempt at criminal success. The Dalton brothers, Grat, Bob, and Emmett, originated from Coffeyville, Kansas, a modest town on the borderlands of Missouri and Kansas. They were raised in a world still adjusting to the upheaval of the Civil War, where law enforcement was uneven, towns were isolated, and opportunity and danger often walked hand in hand. From a young age, the Daltons were exposed to frontier justice, local feuds, and the practicalities of survival in a landscape where chance encounters with violence could prove deadly. Their early lives were ordinary in many ways, tending to livestock, working on farms, and moving through a society defined by labor, scarcity, and shifting allegiances. But their adolescence was also steeped in tales of outlaws and robberies, shaping an imagination attuned to risk, strategy, and the allure of sudden wealth. By the early 1892s, the Dalton Gang had emerged as a cohesive unit, with ambitions that extended far beyond local theft. They sought the larger rewards offered by train robberies, where a single heist could yield thousands of dollars in cash, bonds, and valuables. The lure was obvious. Trains traveled predictable routes, carried significant sums, and often had minimal protection compared to the town's banks. But these apparent advantages were deceptive. Successful robbery required careful observation of train schedules, personnel habits, and the geography surrounding rail lines. Escape routes had to be meticulously planned, and contingencies for unpredictable events, mechanical failures, unexpected passengers, or lawmen needed to be prepared. The margin for error was slim. Any oversight could, and often did, turn a bold plan into disaster. The first notable train robbery attempt by the Dalton Gang occurred in Adair, Indian Territory. The plan was ambitious: stop the train, subdue the crew, and escape with the cash. On paper, it seemed straightforward. But the details mattered. Timing was critical. Even a delay of a few minutes could place the gang in conflict with law enforcement or alert the crew to resist. The Daltons conducted surveillance, noting the schedule and the movement of guards, but small miscalculations quickly emerged. Horses were positioned in advance but not fully secured, and the gang underestimated the response time of the station master and local townspeople. The raid itself descended into chaos. Panic spread among passengers and crew. Shots were fired. And, though the gang managed to escape, the haul was far less than anticipated. The operation had succeeded only partially, highlighting both the ambition and the operational flaws of the gang. The failure of this first attempt offers insight into a broader pattern in outlaw operations: the interplay between human error and environmental unpredictability. Even minor mistakes, a horse bolting prematurely, a misjudged timing of the train's arrival, or a guard noticing something unusual could turn a meticulously planned robbery into a near catastrophe. The Daltons' experiences illustrate the importance of preparation, not just in principle, but in execution. Observation and planning were not sufficient unless every detail was anticipated and rehearsed. Survival and profit were as much about avoiding errors as they were about boldness. Following the Adair incident, the Dalton Gang did not abandon train robbery. Instead, they refined their strategies, attempting to learn from past mistakes. Yet, the challenges persisted. Trains, while predictable en route, were subject to delays, mechanical issues, and unexpected cargo changes. Crew members varied in skill, alertness, and willingness to resist. Local communities, too, could intervene. In many frontier towns, citizens were armed, resourceful, and attuned to the movements of outlaws. The Daltons' next ventures required even greater coordination, reconnaissance, and patience. Failure was not a single event, but a recurring risk. A reminder that the environment was as much an adversary as any human opponent. Daily life for the Dalton gang, between attempts at robbery, was dominated by the logistics of survival. Unlike the dramatized depictions of constant high-stakes action, much of their existence involved mundane, repetitive tasks: maintaining horses, cleaning, and checking firearms, observing potential targets from a distance, and communicating with allies discreetly. Each day demanded vigilance. Even minor lapses could betray their location or intentions. The monotony of these preparations is often overlooked in popular narratives, yet it formed the backbone of any potential success. Without consistent attention to routine, even the most audacious plans were doomed. One particularly instructive aspect of their failures was how they underestimated the unpredictability of human behavior. Train crews, passengers, and townspeople did not always conform to the Daltons' expectations. Resistance could come from the most unlikely quarters: a station clerk refusing to comply, a passenger taking cover and firing a pistol, or a conductor improvising to escape and alert law enforcement. These variables, difficult to anticipate, often disrupted plans that were theoretically sound. In this way, the Daltons' story highlights a fundamental truth of frontier crime. Success relied not solely on planning, but on adaptability in the face of unpredictable human and environmental factors. The infamous robbery at Alila, California, in 1892, further illustrates the Daltons' combination of ambition and flawed execution. The plan involved stopping a train, securing the valuables, and escaping to a pre-arranged safe house. Yet, even with reconnaissance, the gang encountered unanticipated resistance. Passengers attempted to interfere, the train's mechanical schedule deviated slightly, and a single miscommunication among gang members nearly turned the operation into a disaster. Although the robbery yielded some cash, the overall results were disappointing compared to the risks involved. Observers noted that the gang's audacity often outpaced their practical capabilities. Their failures, while dramatic, were rooted in human error, misjudgment, and the inherent unpredictability of frontier life. Beyond the immediate logistics of train robberies, the Daltons faced the challenge of managing public perception and reputation. Like other outlaws, they relied on a combination of fear, respect, and local support. A reputation for boldness could intimidate opponents and encourage compliance, but failures also undermined credibility. Each misstep was observed, remembered, and, in some cases, exploited by law enforcement and rival factions. The social dimension of outlaw life was constant. Success depended not only on physical skill and planning, but also on the management of perception, loyalty, and influence within the communities they traversed. And so, the story of the Dalton gang's train robbery failures begins not with explosions or gunfire, but with the slow, often painstaking work of preparation, observation, and calculation. Their misadventures reveal the invisible labor that underpins every criminal operation: scouting routes, monitoring routines, maintaining supplies, and anticipating human and environmental variables. The failures themselves are instructive, illustrating the delicate balance between ambition, caution, and adaptability in a world where one small error could mean capture or death. Yet, one cannot help but wonder, why did the Daltons persist despite repeated failures? Was it simple greed, a drive for notoriety, or an inability to adapt lessons from past mistakes? Could they have survived longer had they exercised more patience? Or was their ambition inevitably doomed to clash with the realities of frontier life? These questions linger, quietly setting the stage for the next series of attempts and miscalculations that would define the gang's short-lived legend. After the mixed results of their initial train robberies, The Dalton gang faced a difficult decision: retreat into relative obscurity, or double down on increasingly risky attempts to seize larger rewards. Their ambitions were fueled not only by potential financial gain, but also by the growing notoriety that each failed and partially successful robbery brought. In the lawless environment of the late 19th century American West, reputation was currency. A gang perceived as bold and audacious could intimidate both townspeople and train crews, while hesitation or repeated failure could quickly erode credibility. For the Daltons, the line between survival, ambition, and legend was delicate and increasingly dangerous. The gang's life between robberies was dominated by meticulous planning and constant adaptation. Unlike casual depictions in popular culture, the Daltons did not simply ride up to a train with guns drawn. Each operation involved weeks, sometimes months, of preparation. They studied rail schedules, noting deviations caused by weather, maintenance, or mechanical failure. They observed the behavior of train conductors and crews, memorized guard routines, and identified escape routes through forests, plains, and river crossings. Horses had to be acquired, fed, and strategically positioned, while firearms required careful maintenance to ensure reliability in moments of extreme stress. The gang's daily routine was a rhythm of observation, maintenance, and incremental calculation, punctuated by bursts of high-risk action. Yet, despite these preparations, unpredictability remained their constant adversary. In the case of the infamous train robbery near Coffeyville, Kansas, in 1892, minor errors compounded into disaster. The Daltons had scouted the route, identified the schedules, and planned a rapid escape. On the day of the robbery, however, unforeseen variables emerged. Local townspeople had been alerted to the gang's movements, some passengers resisted, and a single horse bolted unexpectedly, disrupting the escape sequence. The gang was forced into a chaotic confrontation in which 3 members, Grat, Bob, and others were killed, while Emmett narrowly escaped. The operation highlighted the razor-thin margin between success and catastrophe. Even meticulous planning could not fully account for human behavior, environmental factors, or sheer chance. One recurring theme in the gang's failures was overextension. In their ambition to seize larger sums, they increasingly targeted trains with heavier cash reserves, more passengers, and greater defensive measures. Each escalation introduced new variables: more witnesses, better armed personnel, and greater scrutiny from law enforcement. The Daltons' audacity, once an advantage, became a liability. Their strategies often relied on assumptions that reality quickly contradicted, demonstrating the fragile calculus of frontier criminal enterprise. Unlike outlaws who survived for decades by carefully managing risk, the Daltons' willingness to push beyond the safe limits of planning exposed them to fatal consequences. Despite these dangers, the gang displayed remarkable resourcefulness and adaptability in quieter moments. After each failed or partially successful attempt, they regrouped, repaired equipment, resupplied horses, and re-evaluated strategies. Outlaw life was not continuous excitement. It was a relentless cycle of preparation, observation, and learning from mistakes. This hidden labor often went unnoticed by contemporaries and historians alike, overshadowed by the dramatic failures that made the headlines. Yet, without this painstaking work, the Daltons could not have executed even the brief moments of success that punctuated their short-lived career. Social dynamics also played a critical role. The gang relied on networks of sympathizers and informants, both within towns and among isolated ranches. Maintaining these connections demanded negotiation, discretion, and sometimes coercion. Loyalty was fragile, easily undermined by fear, reward, or personal ambition. The Daltons' failures were not solely the result of miscalculations during robberies. They were also influenced by lapses in social management, such as overestimating the reliability of allies or underestimating the willingness of townspeople to resist. The human element, in both support and opposition, proved as decisive as terrain or weaponry. Psychologically, the toll of repeated failures and constant pursuit was immense. Each botched operation heightened tension and risk, requiring the gang to balance audacity with caution. Fear, fatigue, and stress were daily companions, yet they had to maintain the composure necessary to execute high-stakes robberies. The Daltons' short lifespan as a gang, roughly 5 years of coordinated criminal activity, reflects the cumulative pressures of environment, human behavior, and operational risk. Their story illustrates the precariousness of outlaw life in a world where a single oversight could mean the end. The gang's increasing desperation also manifested in their methods. Early attempts had been relatively cautious, emphasizing reconnaissance and selective engagement. Later operations, driven by the need for larger rewards or a sense of escalating fame, became bolder and less disciplined. This shift was fatal. The infamous Coffeyville raid exemplified this escalation. The attempt to rob 2 banks simultaneously required perfect timing, precise coordination, and flawless execution. Any deviation, uncooperative townspeople, miscommunication among gang members, or a single unanticipated lawman would undermine the entire plan. In this case, every contingency failed, producing one of the most notorious and deadly events in the gang's history. The narrative of the Dalton gang reminds us that outlaw life was rarely glamorous. Behind each sensational robbery were hours of mundane labor, observing schedules, repairing equipment, tending horses, maintaining safe houses, and monitoring allies and opponents. The failures that defined their story were not merely the result of recklessness, but were shaped by the relentless complexity of human and environmental variables. Success demanded more than audacity. It required precise planning, adaptability, and careful management of both logistics and human relationships. The gang's dramatic missteps offer a cautionary tale about the limits of ambition when confronted with unpredictable reality. By the early 1892, the Dalton gang's trajectory was set. Their escalating ambitions, combined with the unforgiving challenges of frontier life and law enforcement, made catastrophic failure increasingly inevitable. Yet in examining their story, one observes a recurring lesson. In a world of high stakes and fragile margins, preparation, observation, and patience often outweigh boldness and daring. Even when failure is inevitable, the quiet work of planning, adaptation, and risk management illuminates the realities of survival in a chaotic environment, a truth that is easily overlooked in the retelling of explosive outlaw legends. And so, as the Daltons prepared for what would become their final, fatal robbery in Coffeyville, one cannot help but ask, were they driven by greed, reputation, or a lack of caution? Could they have survived longer had they tempered ambition with patience, or was their fate sealed by the very environment that nurtured both opportunity and danger? These questions linger in the dusty rail lines and abandoned safe houses of the Southwest, where the lessons of failed ambition echo quietly across time. The Dalton gang's final chapter is often remembered in the annals of outlaw history for the dramatic Coffeyville, Kansas raid of October 5, 1892, a moment of audacious ambition that ended in near total disaster. Unlike the carefully coordinated, smaller-scale robberies they had attempted previously, this operation required extreme precision, coordination, and timing. The plan was to simultaneously rob 2 banks, seize the cash, and escape through a pre-arranged network of alleys, horses, and countryside routes. On paper, it promised a windfall that could set the gang up for years. In practice, the environment, human factors, and minor miscalculations combined to create a catastrophic failure. Preparation for the Coffeyville raid was extensive. The Daltons had studied the layout of the town, the bank schedules, and the positioning of local law enforcement. Horses were secured at the periphery of town, weapons cleaned and double-checked, and escape routes mapped with attention to detail. Yet, despite the meticulous planning, the gang failed to anticipate several critical variables. First, the townspeople had learned of the gang's intentions, likely through rumors or inadvertent leaks. Second, the physical environment, a narrow main street with limited cover, was not conducive to a clean, rapid escape. Third, human behavior proved unpredictable. Armed citizens and bank employees reacted immediately, refusing compliance and returning fire with precision. Each of these factors transformed a well-laid plan into a deadly ordeal. When the gang emerged onto Coffeyville's main street, the raid quickly descended into chaos. The narrowness of the streets, combined with the number of armed defenders, prevented the gang from executing the precise maneuvers they had rehearsed. Shots rang out, horses bolted prematurely, and small errors amplified into life-threatening consequences. Within minutes, Grat and Bob Dalton, the gang's leaders, lay dead on the streets, while other members, including Emmett, scrambled to avoid capture or death. The drama of the moment, immortalized in newspapers and dime novels, obscured the slower, more methodical reality that preceded it. Hours of observation, days of preparation, and months of prior experience. Without this underlying labor, even the brief bursts of activity during the raid would have been impossible. Yet, even meticulous preparation could not overcome the unpredictability of human resistance and environmental constraints. The aftermath of Coffeyville illustrates the harsh realities of outlaw life in the late 19th century West. The surviving gang members were quickly apprehended or killed, ending the Dalton gang's ambitions in violent finality. Their story underscores a fundamental principle: preparation, patience, and adaptability are as crucial to survival as daring and skill. Boldness without contingency planning is often fatal. The Daltons' repeated miscalculations, whether in underestimating human resistance, overestimating the reliability of accomplices, or misjudging environmental constraints, were instrumental in their demise. Their narrative is a cautionary tale about the limits of audacity in the face of complex social and physical realities. Daily life for the gang, often overlooked in popular accounts, was dominated by repetition and mundane labor. Horses had to be fed and maintained, weapons cleaned, repaired, and tested, supplies gathered and hidden. Communication with allies required subtlety and caution. Safe houses had to be secured against detection. Each robbery, dramatic as it may appear, was the product of these quieter, largely invisible activities. The gang's failures highlight how even minor lapses in these routines, such as a horse spooked prematurely or a miscalculated lookout, could cascade into disaster. The visible drama of shootouts and robberies rested on a foundation of painstakingly maintained logistics, which, when disrupted, revealed the fragility of outlaw operations. Social dynamics were equally decisive. The Daltons' relationships with townspeople, fellow outlaws, and informants shaped opportunities and threats. A single misjudged alliance could betray them. A misread reaction from a citizen could trigger lethal resistance. Human behavior, inherently unpredictable, was a constant variable that no amount of planning could fully control. This interplay between preparation and unpredictability is central to understanding why the Daltons' career, though audacious, ended abruptly. Their story is not merely one of boldness gone wrong, but of the complex, often invisible systems, logistical, social, and psychological that underpinned outlaw survival and failure. The Coffeyville raid also provides insight into the psychology of the gang. By escalating to a simultaneous double bank robbery, the Daltons demonstrated both ambition and overconfidence. They had survived smaller-scale attempts through careful planning, adaptability, and some degree of luck. The desire to achieve a legendary haul overrode prudence, illustrating how reputation, ambition, and perceived opportunity could influence decision-making. In this sense, their ultimate failure was as much about human psychology as about tactical execution. The pressures of fame, greed, and risk compounded the already precarious nature of life on the frontier. Reflecting on the Dalton gang's story, one sees the delicate balance that defined outlaw existence. Preparation, observation, patience, and adaptability versus audacity, ambition, and the inherent unpredictability of human and environmental factors. The gang's failures are not simply anecdotal footnotes. They reveal the essential mechanics of frontier crime, where the mundane realities of survival equipment, maintenance, reconnaissance, social negotiation, were as crucial as the moment of action itself. Their legend, like so many from the Wild West, is built on both daring exploits and the often invisible labor of survival that enabled those exploits to occur. The Coffeyville disaster also reminds us that the American West, often romanticized for its wide-open spaces and heroic outlaws, was a place governed by complex social dynamics, geography, and chance. The Daltons' fate was sealed not only by bullets, but by a combination of environmental factors, human behavior, and accumulated risk. Their story is a testament to the fragility of criminal enterprise when ambition exceeds preparation and when unpredictability collides with human overreach. In the end, the Dalton gang's train robbery failures offer a nuanced lesson in survival, risk, and ambition. Even the most audacious plans require careful groundwork, disciplined execution, and a constant awareness of variables beyond one's control. Boldness alone is rarely enough in a world where human response, environmental unpredictability, and chance can overturn even the most meticulously crafted schemes. And yet, one cannot help but ask, had the Daltons tempered ambition with patience, learned more from previous failures, or chosen less conspicuous targets, could they have survived longer? Or were they, like so many figures of the Wild West, destined for a violent collision with reality the moment ambition outpaced caution? The empty streets of Coffeyville, the abandoned rail lines, and the scattered remnants of safe houses continue to whisper these questions, leaving the story unresolved, quiet, and haunting the epitome of what history preserves beneath the legend. In the early 1860s, long before telegraphs crisscrossed the American West or telephones connected cities across great distances, the Pony Express emerged as a vital, if short-lived, solution to the challenge of communication. For approximately 18 months, from April 1860 to October 1861, this network of riders and stations carried letters and small packages across nearly 2,000 miles of treacherous terrain between Missouri and California. At the heart of this enterprise were the riders themselves, young, lean, and daring men, tasked with transporting critical messages across deserts, mountains, rivers, and hostile territories. Their work was exhausting, monotonous, dangerous, and often unnoticed in the broader sweep of history, yet it played a critical role in connecting a rapidly expanding nation. The life of a Pony Express rider began long before the first relay of the day. Each morning, riders inspected their horses, cleaned and greased their saddles, and carefully prepared the leather pouches containing the mail. These pouches, known as mochilas, were small, square leather cases with 4 pockets, designed to hold letters and sometimes valuable parcels. Securing the mochila on the horse required skill and precision. It had to be fastened tightly enough to remain in place during gallops over rocky paths and sudden descents, but not so tight as to injure the horse. For a rider, the success of the day depended as much on these small, careful preparations as on endurance or courage. One loose strap could lead to lost mail, a wounded horse, or worse. Riders were typically between 16 and 21 years old, chosen for their lightweight, stamina, and resilience. Youth was prized not only because of the physical demands of the job, but because a lighter rider placed less strain on the horse, allowing for longer stretches at high speed. Physical fitness, however, was only part of the equation. A successful rider needed an intimate understanding of terrain, weather patterns, and animal behavior. The West was unpredictable. Sudden thunderstorms could turn trails to mud, snow could block passes, and rivers could swell unexpectedly. Horses, essential partners in the work, required constant attention. They were changed at relay stations, but their care, feeding, and hydration remained critical. A fatigued or poorly managed horse could easily end a rider's journey, and the mail along with it. The daily schedule was relentless. Riders typically covered 75 to 100 miles in a single shift, changing horses every 10 to 15 miles at relay stations. Each handoff demanded precision. The new horse had to be mounted quickly, the mochila transferred smoothly, and the departing rider had to accelerate immediately to maintain schedule. Delays were costly, both to the rider's reputation and to the operational efficiency of the Pony Express. Riders traveled at speeds that pushed both themselves and their horses to the limits, navigating unfamiliar terrain and avoiding obstacles ranging from fallen trees to unbridged creeks. Fatigue, dehydration, and injury were constant risks. Yet the service depended on adherence to an almost impossible schedule. The mail, whether love letters, business contracts, or government communications, had to move faster than any other method available at the time. The monotony of the journey was punctuated by moments of acute danger. Riders frequently crossed territories inhabited by Native American tribes, some of whom were hostile due to encroachment on their lands, broken treaties, or previous conflicts with settlers. Bandits and thieves were also a threat, drawn to the possibility of intercepting valuable mail or stealing horses. These dangers required constant vigilance. Riders carried firearms, usually a single Colt revolver, for defense. But the real skill lay in avoiding confrontations through careful observation and strategic navigation. Many riders reported that their most effective defense was speed, terrain knowledge, and the ability to anticipate human behavior, rather than reliance on weaponry alone. Despite the dangers, much of the rider's experience was marked by a slow rhythm of repetitive travel. Miles of desert, plains, and forest passed beneath hooves in near silence, interrupted only by the occasional relay or encounter. Riders had to maintain focus and endurance, often battling physical discomforts such as sunburn, windburn, and muscle fatigue. The uniformity of the daily routine, mount, ride, change, horse, continue, might appear dull in retrospect, yet it was central to the operation's success. In this sense, the boring aspects of the job were inseparable from the heroic elements often celebrated in popular culture. The true heroism of Pony Express riders was as much about persistence and reliability as about daring escapes or confrontations. Relay stations, spaced approximately 10 to 15 miles apart, were lifelines for the riders. These stations were modest affairs, often nothing more than small cabins with corrals and a cache of horses. Station keepers, themselves largely isolated from towns and communities, bore responsibility for feeding, watering, and preparing the horses for incoming riders. The coordination between stations and riders was critical. Delays or errors at one station could ripple through the network, jeopardizing multiple deliveries. The monotonous yet exacting work of station management, feeding horses, maintaining tack, ensuring accurate timing, was the invisible backbone of the Pony Express, allowing the daring exploits of the riders to succeed. In addition to physical endurance, riders needed mental resilience. The West was a lonely place. Long stretches without human contact, exposure to extreme weather, and the constant threat of danger required focus and determination. Riders developed routines to maintain alertness, including pacing, mental rehearsal of routes, and careful monitoring of their horse's condition. Any lapse in attention could result in a crash, the loss of valuable mail, or fatal injury. The ability to persist in the face of monotony, isolation, and exhaustion was as essential as horsemanship or marksmanship. Weather posed additional challenges. In winter, mountain passes could become treacherous with snow and ice. In summer, the heat of the plains was oppressive, dehydrating both riders and horses. Storms could render trails impassable or obscure landmarks, making navigation difficult. Riders had to develop an acute sense of direction, relying on terrain features, stars, and occasionally maps that were rudimentary at best. Survival often depended on observation and adaptation, rather than sheer speed or force. The small, methodical adjustments made in response to environmental conditions were critical, even if largely invisible to outsiders. The cargo itself, letters, financial documents, and occasionally parcels, was of enormous importance. Though small in volume compared to modern communications, the content of each delivery could influence businesses, government decisions, and personal relationships. Riders carried a responsibility that extended beyond personal survival. They were conduits for trust, connecting distant points across a vast and often hostile landscape. The successful delivery of mail required not only physical skill, but a mindset of discipline, accuracy, and reliability. Mistakes could have consequences far beyond the rider, affecting commerce, governance, and community ties. Even with all this preparation and responsibility, the life of a Pony Express rider was remarkably brief. Few survived long in the role due to the physical demands, environmental hazards, and constant threat of violence. Yet for those who rode, the experience shaped resilience, discipline, and an intimate understanding of the land. Their work, largely uncelebrated in real time, laid the groundwork for faster communication and, indirectly, the expansion of the United States westward. It was the combination of daring and repetition, the extraordinary embedded in the ordinary, that defined their contribution. As we follow the rhythm of the riders' days, one begins to appreciate the quiet courage inherent in sustained monotony. For all the dramatic depictions of galloping through storms or evading hostile parties, the true challenge was enduring long stretches of isolation, navigating difficult terrain, and maintaining precise schedules over hundreds of miles. Each successful delivery was the result of countless unremarkable decisions: checking a strap, pacing a horse, observing distant landmarks, and calculating risk versus speed. Heroism in this context was woven from persistence and attentiveness, rather than flashes of spectacle. And yet, even in the midst of this careful, disciplined routine, one cannot help but ask, what drove these young men to risk life and limb for a fleeting paycheck and fleeting fame? Was it the allure of adventure, the necessity of employment, or a desire to carve a name in the vast, often indifferent West? The answers are buried in the miles of dust, worn trails, and silent horse paths that crisscross the frontier, unseen, uncelebrated, yet indispensable to the story of American expansion and communication. These questions linger as the riders pressed onward, mile after mile, into the uncertain horizon of the western frontier. As the Pony Express operated through 1860 and into 1861, the daily grind of riders' lives revealed an often overlooked truth. Their success depended less on spectacular heroics and more on routine, observation, and quiet endurance. Riding across nearly 2,000 miles of frontier terrain demanded extraordinary stamina, but even greater was the mental resilience required to navigate the relentless monotony punctuated by moments of acute danger. The riders' journeys were framed by countless small decisions: checking the condition of a horse, adjusting the fit of the saddle, pacing through treacherous terrain, and anticipating environmental hazards. These ordinary-seeming acts, repeated hundreds of times over miles of trail, were critical for survival and operational success. One of the most striking aspects of the riders' work was the need for constant vigilance. Even in stretches of open prairie or forest where the landscape seemed safe, riders could encounter hidden obstacles, sudden dips in terrain, deep creeks, or loose rocks that threatened a misstep at high speed. Horses could stumble, equipment could fail, and weather could turn perilous in moments. Riders had to scan the landscape continuously, adjusting their position, speed, and posture to minimize risk. A fall at full gallop, even if the horse remained uninjured, could leave the rider stranded far from help in hostile territory. Each mile demanded not only endurance, but acute awareness, a combination of physical skill and mental discipline that distinguished the successful riders from those who failed or perished. The network of relay stations played a central role in mitigating these risks. Stations, spaced roughly 10 to 15 miles apart, functioned as logistical nodes that allowed riders to rest briefly, swap horses, and resupply. The efficiency of each station was vital. Any lapse a tired horse, poorly trained station keeper, or mismanaged equipment could cascade into delays or dangerous exposure. Riders developed routines for approaching and departing each station, calculating the precise timing for handoffs, pacing the horse to avoid sudden exhaustion, and ensuring the mochila was transferred smoothly. While these procedures may seem mundane, they were essential to the integrity of the entire enterprise. Success was not measured in spectacular feats alone, but in the accumulation of countless small, disciplined actions, repeated under pressure. Weather presented another layer of complexity. Riders traversed deserts where heat was oppressive, mountains where snow and ice made paths treacherous, and plains where thunderstorms could swell rivers in minutes. Each condition required adaptive strategies, slowing in heavy mud to protect the horse's legs, seeking shelter during sudden storms, or conserving water during extended stretches without streams. Riders learned to read the signs of the environment, the smell of approaching rain, changes in wind direction, shifts in animal behavior, to make split-second decisions that could mean life or death. These adaptations were subtle, often unnoticed in historical accounts, yet they formed the foundation of the Pony Express's operational success. Equally significant was the relationship between rider and horse. Horses were not simply vehicles. They were essential partners in survival. Each horse was carefully selected for speed, endurance, and temperament. Riders learned to recognize fatigue, dehydration, and distress, adjusting pace and distributing workload across multiple animals in succession. The change of horses at relay stations was not merely a convenience, it was a strategic imperative, ensuring that each animal remained capable of sustained performance over long distances. The rider's attentiveness to their mounts exemplifies the delicate interplay between human skill and animal capability that defined frontier survival. Beyond physical and environmental challenges, the riders faced human threats. While much of the route passed through sparsely populated areas, encounters with bandits, hostile Native American groups, and occasionally vigilant townsfolk were real dangers. Riders carried firearms for protection, yet their most effective defense was often subtle observation and strategic decision-making rather than confrontation. Speed, knowledge of terrain, and timing often provided a safer path than armed resistance. Avoiding conflict required reading human behavior, anticipating likely reactions, and making rapid judgments in unpredictable circumstances. The rider's skill lay not just in endurance, but in the quiet application of strategy under pressure. Despite the routine and danger, there was a sense of rhythm to the riders' lives. Each day followed a pattern: mounting, riding, changing horses, observing the landscape, and preparing for the next leg. This rhythm, while monotonous, provided structure in an otherwise unpredictable world. Riders developed mental routines to maintain focus, including scanning the horizon, pacing their breathing, and monitoring both horse and equipment. These small acts of attentiveness were crucial. Lapses could result in injury, lost mail, or worse. The monotony was not a failure of the job, but a fundamental feature of it, ensuring consistency and reliability over the long distances that defined the Pony Express route. Social dynamics also played a role in sustaining the operation. Riders were often young and isolated, far from family and community. The relay stations provided brief social contact, but much of the day was spent alone in harsh conditions. Letters, camaraderie with fellow riders, and the knowledge of supporting staff at relay stations offered limited but essential social reinforcement. Maintaining morale, discipline, and focus under conditions of isolation and stress was a subtle, continuous challenge that required psychological resilience. The human element, mental toughness, reliability, and trust in both animal and human allies was as vital as physical endurance in determining success. The work also required adaptability. No route was entirely predictable. Rivers could rise unexpectedly, paths could be blocked, and mechanical issues could slow progress. Riders had to improvise solutions while maintaining speed and safety. This required both experience and judgment, choosing when to push the horse harder, when to find alternate paths, and when to conserve energy. Mistakes could be costly, yet even successful improvisation demanded knowledge of the environment, quick thinking, and a disciplined approach. In this sense, the rider's daily tasks exemplify the often invisible skill that underpinned the operation's legendary reputation for speed. Despite the dangers and routine, the Pony Express riders were motivated by more than the meager pay. Many were driven by the challenge, the opportunity for adventure, and a desire to distinguish themselves in a young, expanding country. Yet this motivation did not negate the hardships. Exposure, injury, and exhaustion were constant, and the risk of death was ever present. Each rider's success depended on balancing audacity with prudence, speed with observation, and independence with coordination across the relay network. The ordinary, repetitive tasks, the grooming of horses, the transfer of mochilas, and the careful navigation of terrain were the invisible backbone of an enterprise, often remembered only for moments of dramatic courage. As the Pony Express neared the end of its brief existence, largely replaced by the telegraph, the legacy of the riders endured in unexpected ways. Their experience demonstrates that endurance, observation, and meticulous attention to detail are as critical as bold action in survival. The heroic narrative of racing across the plains at full gallop is compelling, but it rests on the countless unremarkable acts: maintaining equipment, observing terrain, and pacing horses that made it possible. The real story, much like the rhythm of their daily rides, is quieter, more methodical, and no less impressive. And yet, as these young riders pressed on through deserts, mountains, and plains, one cannot help but wonder, did they appreciate the significance of their work at the time, or was it simply survival and duty that propelled them forward? How many of them contemplated the fragile balance between courage and routine, and the small, deliberate acts that allowed them to carry vital messages across a vast and often unforgiving land? These questions linger in the empty stations, the worn trails, and the silent horseshoes left behind, a testament to the quiet heroism and invisible labor of the Pony Express. The Pony Express, despite its brief existence of just 18 months, remains one of the most iconic symbols of the American West, largely due to the courage, endurance, and discipline of its riders. By late 1861, however, the service was rendered obsolete by the completion of the transcontinental telegraph, which allowed messages to cross the country almost instantaneously. For the riders, this technological shift ended a way of life that, for a brief moment, had combined the thrill of adventure with the monotony of sustained labor. Yet, even in its short lifespan, the Pony Express offers enduring lessons about the human capacity to endure, adapt, and persist in the face of both routine and danger. The final months of the operation were marked by the quiet realities of the riders' daily work. Many had become adept at navigating the terrain, anticipating environmental hazards, and managing the physical and psychological demands of long-distance riding. They understood the subtle patterns of weather and landscape, the cues indicating potential threats, and the rhythms of the relay stations that punctuated their routes. This knowledge was not heroic in the conventional sense, but essential to survival. It was the unglamorous, repetitive labor, checking horses' hooves, fastening saddles, and pacing rides over dusty plains that allowed the riders to complete their journeys successfully. Heroism, in this context, was inseparable from discipline, endurance, and the careful application of learned skills. In the broader social and economic context, the Pony Express played a vital, if ephemeral, role. The service allowed for communication across vast distances at unprecedented speed, linking the eastern United States with California during a period of rapid population growth and territorial expansion. Letters carried by riders connected families, businesses, and government officials in ways that had previously been impossible. The riders' work facilitated commerce, governance, and personal connection across a frontier that was still largely unsettled. This broader significance, often overshadowed by dramatic tales of galloping across plains or evading danger, underscores the importance of consistent, reliable labor in shaping historical outcomes. The boring aspects, the preparation, the routine, the meticulous attention to detail, were critical to the success of the enterprise. Daily life for riders remained physically taxing and mentally demanding until the end. Horses were the central concern. They required rest, proper feeding, and careful management to endure long distances at high speeds. The transfer of the mochila at relay stations demanded precision, and any lapse could result in lost mail, delayed schedules, or danger to the rider. Weather conditions continued to impose challenges. Storms, snow, and extreme heat required constant adjustment, patience, and resilience. Even without the threat of hostile humans, the physical and logistical demands were enough to challenge the strongest riders. Their ability to persist, adapt, and complete their routes in such conditions highlights the importance of endurance and skill in environments where error could have serious consequences. The social structure surrounding the riders was equally important. Station keepers and local communities played a largely invisible yet vital role in supporting the network. They provided horses, food, and shelter, often under conditions of isolation and hardship. Riders relied on these individuals, not only for material support, but also for the coordination necessary to maintain the schedule across nearly 2,000 miles. The seamless execution of the Pony Express depended on the synchronization of many small, often unnoticed actions. Without this human infrastructure, the heroic image of riders dashing across the plains would collapse into chaos. The success of the system lay as much in the coordination of ordinary labor as in moments of visible bravery. One of the enduring myths about the Pony Express is that it was a purely romantic adventure. In reality, the work involved a delicate balance between monotony and acute danger. Riders endured long hours alone in harsh conditions, punctuated by the occasional threat of bandits, hostile tribes, or accidents. The majority of each day was devoted to repetitive, deliberate tasks that ensured survival and operational success. Maintaining focus, pacing the horse, observing terrain, and performing minor but crucial adjustments were far more important than dramatic confrontations. In this sense, the boring aspects of the job were not incidental but central to the rider's survival and the functioning of the entire network. The end of the Pony Express also marked a shift in the perception of frontier communication. While the service lasted only 18 months, it demonstrated the possibilities of rapid, coordinated action across vast distances. The labor of riders and supporting staff illustrated that efficiency, speed, and reliability often depended on painstaking preparation, careful observation, and incremental adjustments. The seemingly minor details, grooming horses, transferring mail, pacing rides, anticipating environmental challenges, were essential components of success. In historical perspective, the operation highlights the quiet, methodical labor that underpins progress, even when the dramatic elements dominate cultural memory. Even after the telegraph rendered the Pony Express obsolete, the legacy of its riders endured. Their methods, discipline, and resilience became reference points for later mail services, transportation networks, and logistical planning. The skills honed in the demanding conditions of the frontier endurance, observation, adaptability, were relevant to countless other professions and operations in the expanding United States. The rider's experience underscores a broader historical lesson that sustained success often relies on the quiet accumulation of routine, preparation, and vigilance, rather than on single acts of courage or daring. Reflecting on the lives of Pony Express riders, one sees a pattern of human resilience in the face of both monotony and danger. The work demanded a combination of physical stamina, mental discipline, and careful attention to the environment and equipment. While history often celebrates dramatic moments of galloping across the plains or narrowly evading danger, it is the invisible labor, the repetitive, meticulous, and disciplined actions that made those moments possible. The rider's legacy lies in their endurance, their adaptability, and their ability to persist in conditions that tested the limits of human and animal capacity. And yet, one is left with a quiet question. Did the riders themselves fully comprehend the significance of their labor, or did they view each journey simply as a task to be completed? Were they aware that the rhythm of their daily routines, transferring mochilas, pacing horses, observing terrain, was shaping the broader communication network of a growing nation? The answers are lost to history, left only in the worn trails, empty stations, and silent hoofbeats echoing across the frontier. In contemplating these details, one recognizes that the true story of the Pony Express is not only one of daring adventure, but also of endurance, discipline and the understated heroism embedded in ordinary labor. In 1848, the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in Coloma, California, set off a chain reaction that would forever transform the American West. News of the glittering metal spread like wildfire, drawing thousands of people from across the United States and even from abroad to California's rugged terrain in hopes of striking it rich. What became known as the California Gold Rush was often romanticized in popular imagination as a time of sudden wealth, daring adventure, and rapid fortune. Yet for the vast majority of miners, daily life was far less glamorous. It was a slow, exhausting grind, dominated by hard labor, precarious living conditions, and the constant uncertainty of success. The story of these miners lies not in the rare instances of sudden fortune, but in the mundane details of persistence, endurance, and human resilience. The first challenge for miners was the journey itself. Many traveled overland on foot or horseback across the Sierra Nevada, or via treacherous wagon trails spanning hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles. Others sailed around the southern tip of South America or through the Isthmus of Panama. These journeys were arduous, often taking months, and subjected travelers to harsh weather, disease, and scarcity of supplies. Many who embarked on the journey to California arrived weakened, exhausted, or ill, already beginning their struggle before even touching the first patch of gold-laden soil. Survival was not guaranteed. For some, the dream of wealth ended long before they reached the mining camps. Upon arrival, miners faced the reality of camp life. Mining settlements sprang up overnight, often lacking any formal governance, sanitation, or permanent infrastructure. Tents, makeshift cabins, or simple lean-tos became homes for hundreds or even thousands of people. Firewood had to be gathered, water fetched from streams, and food sourced locally or brought from distant markets, often at inflated prices. These small, repetitive tasks, cooking meals over open fires, maintaining shelters, and ensuring basic hygiene were essential for survival. They were boring, grueling, and time-consuming, yet without them, even the simplest labor of gold extraction could not proceed. In essence, miners' daily existence was a careful balancing act between labor, subsistence, and maintaining health in an often unforgiving environment. Mining itself demanded physical endurance and technical skill, though the methods were initially rudimentary. Early miners used simple tools: pans, sluices, rockers, and shovels. Gold extraction often involved standing in cold water for hours, shoveling gravel, and carefully sifting through sediment to separate tiny flecks of gold. It was meticulous, repetitive work that required concentration and patience. The process could be demoralizing. For every pan of sediment, miners might find only a few specks of gold, while their companions sometimes struck small nuggets in the same area. Success was inconsistent, and the illusion of rapid wealth often clashed with the reality of relentless, monotonous labor. Miners learned quickly that endurance, attention to detail, and persistence were more critical than luck in the majority of cases. Life in the camps was structured around the practicalities of survival. Men and women, though women were relatively few, divided labor between mining, cooking, cleaning, and repairing equipment. Food was scarce and expensive. Flour, beans, salted meats, and hardtack formed the bulk of the diet, with occasional fresh vegetables or meat scavenged or traded. Water and firewood had to be collected daily, sometimes from miles away, and maintaining clean living conditions was a constant challenge. Disease spread easily in crowded, unsanitary conditions, making hygiene a critical, if repetitive, task. Miners quickly understood that neglecting small details, dirty water, spoiled food, unclean shelters, could have severe consequences, sometimes fatal, in an environment where medical care was limited or non-existent. Despite the harshness of the work, miners established routines and informal systems of governance. Claims were staked, boundaries negotiated, and local rules enforced by community consensus or, in some cases, makeshift courts. Disputes over gold claims, equipment, or theft were common, and enforcement often depended on local miners banding together to uphold agreements. These small, bureaucratic processes, though tedious, were essential for maintaining order in chaotic, rapidly growing camps. The mundane work of monitoring claims, mediating disputes, and organizing resources was as vital to miners' survival as the act of digging itself. Evenings in mining camps offered brief respite, though the monotony of labor continued to shape life after the day's work. Campfires provided warmth and light, and miners would gather to eat, socialize, and share stories. Gambling, card games, and drinking were common pastimes, offering distraction from the exhaustion of the day. Yet these activities were punctuated by practical concerns: repairing equipment, planning the next day's work, and ensuring personal safety and that of the horses and supplies. The rhythms of camp life, work, maintenance, minor social interaction, sleep, and repeat dominated existence, underscoring how even moments of leisure were closely tied to survival. The dangers inherent in mining extended beyond exhaustion and disease. The natural environment posed continuous threats: flash floods, landslides, and accidents with tools or equipment could be fatal. Mining methods often destabilized hillsides or riverbeds, increasing risk for everyone nearby. Knowledge of the land, careful observation of conditions, and disciplined attention to process were essential for avoiding disaster. In this sense, the monotony of routine checking tools, monitoring the stability of the ground, measuring water flow was not merely tedious, but a protective measure that allowed miners to mitigate the significant hazards of their work. Psychologically, miners had to contend with uncertainty. Gold could appear in unpredictable locations, and fortunes were unevenly distributed. Many who arrived with dreams of instant wealth spent months or years extracting only trivial amounts, while others stumbled upon small but valuable discoveries. The emotional toll of repetitive labor, combined with inconsistent reward, was significant. Success depended less on luck than on perseverance, adaptability, and careful attention to process. Miners developed strategies for coping with the monotony and unpredictability, often cultivating routines, small rituals, or communal practices to maintain focus and morale. The story of daily life during the California Gold Rush illustrates that survival, adaptation, and resilience were at least as important as luck. Miners faced physical exhaustion, environmental hazards, disease, and social tensions, all while performing repetitive, exacting labor. Their experience underscores the human capacity to endure extended periods of monotony and uncertainty in pursuit of long-term goals. The dramatic tales of striking it rich, while compelling, were exceptional. For most, the true narrative was shaped by small, repeated actions, careful observation, and the management of routine hazards. It was in the ordinary labor of daily survival that the essence of the gold rush experience was grounded. Even as miners worked tirelessly, one might ask, how did they find motivation amid such relentless monotony? Was it the hope of a sudden strike of fortune, the drive to survive, or the camaraderie and structure within the camps that sustained them? And what did it feel like to measure each day in hours of repetitive labor, uncertain whether it would yield anything beyond exhaustion? These questions linger in the rivers, hills, and abandoned cabins of the gold rush era, revealing a human story of endurance, discipline, and the quiet heroism of ordinary labor.